IP Protection Services. Are you worried about or hesitant to enter the China market thinking that your product's going to be knocked off? Or do you have a product that's going right now and it's possible that there is somebody that is copying it right now? Well, Tom Galey here, author of Making the China Connection. In this book, I've put together a number of tips and ideas, and in this video, I'd like to go over 4 tips that are really going to help you protect your IP. So let's get to it. Tip number 1 is, first of all, you got to change your perspective. I would like you to flip it around in your mind and forget about what you've learned about Western IP protection and think about this. Typical Western company, we come up with a piece of paper. We send people in with expensive suits, we file in court, we do all this stuff, but we never really get to the ground to see where it is. So that's where you need to base your analysis on your risk of IP violation, is to get to the ground and see exactly where it's going on. And this is the system that we set up. You know, if you just think that you've got a piece of paper and you can hand it over to somebody and say this is a cease and desist, that may not do it. I've seen that. I've helped people protect their IP, and that doesn't always work. So you got to change your perspective, you got to get more hands-on, you got to go to the ground, and you got to see how it works and who's doing what, and that's a system that we provide. So tip number 2 is to evaluate your entire supply chain. There's a lot of different ways that product can get out there. One example is, let's take for example Nike. Everybody knows Nike and the swoosh. You can find knockoff fake Nike goods on every street corner in every city of the world. Everybody thinks that there's maybe one reason for that, and there's a hole that we have to stop, or we have to send a letter to a guy that's doing that. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. I can think of several reasons, many more than 1 or 2 reasons why those products are getting out there. One of the reasons could be factory showroom, the sample showroom. Those types of things are in product development and they're supposed to be destroyed. How about reject pile? When you have a reject pile, it's very easy for people to start piecing together components and producing the product there. What about your delivery truck system? There's one step after another that you go through. Now, everybody's heard about the iPhone being made in China. Well, they ship those directly from the factory to the end user, either the store or the person that bought it. There's no stop. It's tracked all the way along the way, and that's what it means to watch your delivery system. And one last tip about evaluating the supply chain is to take a look at the government officials that might be available out there in China. It may be very possible that a government official can be bribed with a case of Nike Air Jordans. That's possible. That type of stuff does happen. So that's what we do, is we evaluate the entire supply chain. That's tip number 2. You need to make sure that you know exactly where your product goes at all stops, all along the way. You know, there was a funny story about back in the days, in the 90s, in Taiwan, where I was working with a research firm, we were developing some product, but there was one employee in our group, it was rather embarrassing, loss of face. This person was developing a product in parallel at the other end of the island. He was duplicating everything that came out to make here. He didn't care if he was going to get fired. He planned on being fired one day in order to run the next factory. So China's come a long way. There's a lot of concept that has been had to be shifted here. Another story that is almost funny, but a couple of years ago I went to ESPN Zone in Shenzhen, China, in southern China. And you know, it was a sports bar. It said ESPN Zone, had the TVs and everything like that. It looked like ESPN Zone. Later I came to find that it wasn't one of the corporate ESPN zones at all. So imagine the surprise and shock that the corporate executives hear when somebody maybe calls up and says, hey, I was at the southern China Shenzhen ESPN Zone location and so. The executive would turn and say, well, we don't have a store there. We don't have a location. We don't have a restaurant there. What are you talking about? But it was there. They just used the name ESPN Zone. They put TVs in. They had a nice little restaurant. They served chicken wings, hot wings, and burgers. And it was an ESPN Zone, but it wasn't authorized ESPN Zone. So that was a pretty interesting story. Okay, so tip number 3 in protecting your intellectual property, and that is to have a presence on the ground in China. Now, I do this as a service for people. I do this all the time. Imagine if you had somebody that actually worked for you, that you trusted and knew and had a relationship with, that could go in and check out things in China. Imagine how cost inefficient it would be to fly somebody out from the States or Europe or somewhere every time you had an issue. What we do is we set people up on the ground with ways to go in. Remember, these people work for you. They've worked for me. I've done business with all this team that I work with. And they will go in for you, and at a fraction of the price, they report to you. They know where their money is coming from. They're loyal to you. It's not Uncle Chen's cousin going in doing an inspection or looking for intellectual property violations. It's your hire, and that's their job, and it gets done. So make sure that you've got a presence on the ground. We can set you up with somebody who's really there, who understands your business, who can go in and check it out. Tip number 4 on protecting intellectual property, and that is split production. Now, what happens if your factory, God forbid, burns down or something like that? What happens if they turn out to be bad at protecting your intellectual property? You have to yank that. But if you don't have a backup factory ready, or somebody else that you're spilling over or developing a relationship with, you're going to be in trouble. You could lose lots of business. Another technique is to split production into 2 different houses. So you've got one factory over here that doesn't know the other factory. They're both producing something different that goes together for your product. So that's a real common strategy, is to split production, and that way if there's violations, you kind of know who to go to and who to talk to. So if you're ready to protect your intellectual property, to keep your copyrights secure, I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to hear a little bit about what you've got. Of course, I'll keep your intellectual property secure, of course. But I'd like to hear from you. Give me a little bit of an indication in the box provided below, and we can talk about it. So those are my 4 tips on how to protect your intellectual property. It works. I look forward to seeing you. Thank you.